Good evening, Carl, from Recording Studio Oxford. Hope that you're having a grand time wherever you are when you see this, and I hope you see this soon. Love you to pieces. I wanted to, we now come to number 38 in our tales called The Golden Goose, and I hope you like it. There was once upon a time a man who had three sons. The youngest of them was called Dullhead, and was sneered and jeered at and snubbed at every possible opportunity. Now one day it happened that the eldest son wished to go into the forest to cut wood, but before he started his mother gave him a fine rich cake and a bottle of wine, so he might be sure not to suffer from hunger or thirst. And when he reached the forest he met a little old grey man who wished him good morning, and said, "Do give me a piece of that cake you have in your pocket, and let me have a draught of your wine, I am so hungry and thirsty." But this clever son replied, "If I give you my cake and wine, I shall have none of it left for myself. You just go your own way." And he left the little man standing there and went on into the forest. Then he began to cut down a tree, but before long he made a false stroke with his axe and cut his arm so badly he was obliged to go home and have it bound up. Then the second son went into the forest, and his mother gave him good cake and a bottle of wine as she had his eldest brother. He too made the little old grey man, who begged him for a morsel of cake and a draught of wine. But the second son spoke most sensibly too, and said, "Whatever I give to you, I deprive myself of. Just go your own way." And not long after this, punishment overtook him, for no sooner had struck a couple of blows on his tree with his axe, he cut his leg so badly that he had to be carried home. So then Dullard said, "Father, let me go out and cut wood." But his father answered, "Both your brothers injured yourself, you'd better leave it alone, you know nothing about it." But Dullard begged so hard he to be allowed to go out that at last his father said, "Very well then, go. Perhaps when you have hurt yourself, you may learn to know better." His mother only gave him a very plain cake, made with water and baked in the cinders, and a bottle of sour beer. Quick explanation, Carl. Cake didn't necessarily mean a big sweet thing there. It could just be like a solid lump of flour mixed with water and made flat. It's kind of like cake could also mean a very cheap kind of bread, like worse than the cheapest bread you get in a baker these days. Well, anyway, when Dullard got to the forest, he too met the little grey man, who greeted him and said, "Give me a piece of your cake and a draught from your bottle. I am so hungry and thirsty." And Dullhead replied, "I've only got a cinder cake and some sour beer, but if you care to have that, then let us sit down and eat." And so they sat down. And when Dullhead brought out his cake, it had turned into a fine rich cake, and the sour beer into excellent wine. Then they ate and drank, and when they had finished, the little man said, "Now I will bring you luck, because you have a kind heart and willing to share what you have with others. There stands an old tree. Cut it down, and among its roots you'll find something." With that, the little man took his leave. Then Dullhead fell at once to hew down the tree, and when he had fell, he found among its roots a goose whose feathers were all of pure gold. He lifted it out and carried it off, and took it with him to an inn where he meant to spend the night. Now the landlord of the inn had three daughters, and when they saw the goose they were filled with curiosity as to what this wonderful bird could be, and each longed to have one of its golden feathers. The eldest thought to herself, "No doubt I shall soon find a good opportunity to pluck out one of its feathers." And the first time Dullhead happened to leave the room, she caught hold of the goose by its wing. But lo and behold, her fingers seemed to stick fast to the goose, and she could not take her hand away. Soon after the second daughter came in, and thought to pluck a golden feather for herself too, but hardly had she touched her sister, than she too stuck fast as well. And at last the third sister came in with the same intentions, but the others two cried out, "Keep off! For heaven's sake, keep off!" The younger sister, who could not imagine why she was to keep off, thought to herself, "If they're both here, why should I not be there too?" So she sprang to them, but no sooner had she touched one of them than she stuck faster. So all three had to spend the night with the goose. And now the next morning Dullhead tucked the goose under his arm and went off, without the least troubling himself with the three girls who were hanging on to it. They just had to run after him right or left as best they could. In the middle of a field they met the parson, and when he saw this procession he said, "For shame, you bold girls! What do you mean running after a young fellow through the fields like that? Do you call this proper behaviour?" And with that he called the youngest girl by the hand to try and draw her away. But directly he touched her he hung on himself, and had to run along with the rest of them. Now not long after the clerk came that way, and was much surprised the parson following the footsteps of the three girls. "Why, where's your reverence going so fast?" cried he. "Don't forget there's to be a christening today." And he ran after and caught them by the sleeve, and hung it himself. And so the five of them trotted along in this fashion, one after the other, and two peasants were coming from their work with their hoes. On seeing him, the parson called out and begged them to come and rescue him and a clerk, but no longer as soon did they touch the clerk than they stuck on too, and all 7 were running after him, Dullhead and his goose. After a time they came to a town where a king reigned whose daughter was so serious and solemn, no one could ever manage to make her laugh, and the king declared that whoever succeeded in making her laugh should marry her. When Dullhead heard this, he marched before the princess with his goose and his appendages, and as soon as she saw these 7 people constantly running after her, she burst out laughing and could not stop herself. Then Dullhead claimed her as his bride, but the king, who did not much fancy him as a son-in-law, made all sorts of objections and told him he must first find a man who could drink up a whole cellar full of wine. Now Dullhead bethought himself of the little grey man who could, he felt sure, help him, and so he went off to the forest, and on the very spot where he cut down the tree saw a man sitting with the most dismal expression of face. Dullhead asked him what he was taking so much to heart, and the man answered, "I don't know how I'm ever to quench this terrible thirst I'm suffering from. Cold water doesn't suit me at all. To be sure, I've emptied a whole barrel of wine, but what is 1 drop on a hot stone?" "I think I can help you," said Dullhead. "Come with me, and you shall drink to your heart's content." So he took him to the king's cellar, and the man sat down before the huge casks and drank until he drank up the whole contents of the cellar before the day closed. Then Dullhead asked once more for his bride, but the king felt vexed at the idea of a stupid fellow whom people called Dullhead carrying off his daughter, and made fresh conditions. He required Dullhead to find a man who could eat a mountain of bread. Dullhead did not wait long to consider, but went straight off to the forest, and there on the same spot sat a man who was drawing in a strap as tight as he could around his body, making a most woeful face. Said he, "I've eaten up a whole oven full of loaves, but what's the good to that anyone as hungry as I am? I declare my stomach feels quite empty, and I must draw my tight if I'm not to die of starvation." Dullhead was delighted and said, "Get up and come with me, and you shall have plenty to eat," and he brought him to the king's court. Now the king had given orders to have all the flour in his kingdom brought together and to have a huge mountain baked of it. But the man from the wood just took up a stand before the mountain and began to eat, and one day it had all vanished. And for the 3rd time Dullhead asked for his bride, but again the king tried to make some evasion and demanded a ship which could sail on land or water. "When you have come sailing in such a ship," said he, "you shall have my daughter without further delay." And again Dullhead started on the forest, and there he found the little old grey man, with whom he shared his cake, and who said, "I have eaten and I have drunk for you, and now I will give you the ship. I have done all this for you because you were kind and merciful to me." Then he gave Dullhead a ship which could sail on land or water, and when the king saw it, he felt he could no longer refuse him his daughter. So they celebrated the wedding with great rejoicing, and after the king's death, Dullhead succeeded his kingdom and lived happily with his wife for many years thereafter. Here we come across something that is constant in these stories. Always be respectful of the fair folk, and you never know when you might meet one, because they remember insults, and sometimes they do reward kindnesses. Until tomorrow, Carl. Love you to pieces.